That third clip, when it comes up, leave our audio on. There is no audio on the tape.
Maybe that works.
Good evening. Welcome to Liberty and Justice for All. What you are watching is part of the Western Shoshone, and if you've been following the newspapers locally, we had another cattle kidnapping, cattle rustling, cattle theft. I don't know what else to call it. That's the only thing I could come up with. From the chief of the Western Shoshone Council in northern Nevada, or eastern Nevada, I'm sorry, up around Elko in the Ruby Valley. The BLM stole his cattle, auctioned them, sold them 27 cents on the dollar, and never answered a single question that Raymond Yowell, the chief, kept asking. He was assuming, and he thought, because of the Ruby Valley Treaty, which we'll get into a little bit tonight, that the cattle were actually his property and were on Indian land. The BLM said different. They wouldn't say why, they just said different. Stole his cows, sold them, and what you just saw was part of a demonstration at the burro and horse facility in Palomino Valley here, where they were holding the cows hostage. Now, too many things have gone on. You've watched many times in the show. We've had different people on that have been beat up in just about every way possible. This is just another one, only now the Indians are involved, and they're not happy, and I don't blame them. They have a treaty. A treaty is a supreme law of the land, supposedly. We've talked a little bit about the Constitution, and it explains treaties anyway. We're going to explain to you as much as we can what's going on, but there was another cattle theft. I have invited the BLM here tonight, and I will read their statement for you in a little while. But I have the honor of having former Congresswoman Helen Chenoweth Hage with us tonight. She was in Idaho. She limited herself to 2 terms, which is very honorable. But while she was there, she really ticked off a lot of people, and she really made a lot of people happy. We're on the happy side. Also tonight we have Wayne Hage, author of Storm Over Rangeland. Wayne was the first, if I believe, to have his cows stolen by the BLM instead of answering questions. Both of you, welcome to the show. It is an honor. I mean, it is really an honor to have you two here.
Thank you, Dennis.
Thank you. You are pioneers in doing this work. And I understand, Wayne, you just had a victory in...
Yes, Dennis. In 1991, our cattle were stolen by the Forest Service. And this was a result of years and years of hassle. And keep in mind that at the bottom of all of this is one word: water. Mm-hmm. Somebody wants the rancher's water. And you've got to drive him off the range to be able to steal his water. So that's what's been underway for a long time. It had become so intense by 1991, and when they finally moved in and stole 104 head of our cattle, that I just came to the conclusion, look, to the United States, mm-hmm. if you want this ranch that bad, then fine. The Constitution says you have the authority to take private property for public use, but the same Constitution you get that authority under also says you have to pay for it. So here's a bill. So I handed them a bill for the ranch, and we ended up at the United States Court of Federal Claims. And on January 29th of this year, we got down a massive decision in favor of Westerners, landowners in general, and particularly ranches.
Mm-hmm. And basically it said that you own the water, right? I mean, that's pretty general, I know.
Yes, there was, that was one of the issues. Did we own the water rights? Because the Forest Service had come in and filed water claims over the top of our claims at a date clear back to the 1860s. Mm-hmm. And then they also used this same myth that the BLM and the Forest Service and the environmentalists have pushed for so many years, that these are public lands. Well, the United States Supreme Court has defined what public lands are and what they are not. Mm-hmm. The United States Supreme Court has told us over and over that land to which any right or claim of another attaches is not public land. Well, our whole issue was over the fact that we owned the water rights, and then obviously we had some ownership interest out there in the use of those lands, mm-hmm. because the IRS taxes somebody on it. You know, if they die, the estate has to pay a big tax.
Right.
And so finally this court came down and said, yes, we own those vested water rights, and then defined what these grazing allotments are, that the BLM and the Forest Service and the environmentalists and other agitators have been saying for so long, calling them public lands. And the court said, no, these are fee lands, and you have title to these fee lands. So if I have title to these fee lands, I think that virtually any rancher in the western United States also has title to those fee lands. Right. That's the big impact of this decision.
So you helped out basically the whole West, or at least 11 states that are under more attack, more so than East.
Well, you know, going back on this, and 20 years ago, I remember talking on a panel. I had one of the Washington people from Interior Department on the panel with me. I had one of the regional foresters on the panel with me. And I gave them a warning. And I said, look, the people that used to be in the Forest Service, used to be in the Telegrazing Service, used to be in the BLM, understood never to push the rancher so far as to take his rights. They'd regulate him, but never push him so far as to take his rights. But those people, I told them at the time, most of those people are either in their grave or they're retired. And we have a new bunch in here that are following the dictates of the environmental movement and the myths that they've been putting forward.
Right.
And they're going to push this thing so far that somebody's going to take one of these cases to the United States Court of Federal Claims, and we're going to get this settled. At that time, I didn't know I was going to be the guy.
Right, lucky you. I was going to say lucky you again, too, because you're married to Helen.
Oh, I agree with that.
And years before, I used to pick up the New American and various magazines, and here's these articles, Helen Chenoweth, and she's in Congress, and I'm thinking, who is this person? She's talking truth, you're talking law, you're talking freedom and justice. What made, well, I know what made you do it, and I'd like you to tell the audience what made you do it, but how did you do it? How did you get there?
Well, I don't know. I really think it was a miracle. But I know, Dennis, I actually served 3 terms. And,
oh, 3 terms.
And
great.
there were 6 people running in the primary. And I was probably deemed by the press to be about 4th, a distant 4th. And the night of the election, of the primary election, when I went into that election night, I was prepared to lose, thinking, oh good, I did what I should do, and now I can go back and make a living. And doggone, I won by more than the majority or the combined votes of all of my opponents. So it was a miracle. But you know, people respond to freedom and liberty, and they respond to people who will put their name on the line and go back there and fight for them.
Right.
Because every day people are fighting out here in their everyday life. They are struggling for that fabulous word, this idea that is America, called freedom. And doggone it, sometimes our lawyers and politicians are giving away our freedoms about as fast as we're trying to hang on to them. And certainly the seizure of the cattle here in Nevada is a crying shame, but it's a demonstration of the fact that our own federal government is at war with its own people.
Exactly.
And they are doing things in a manner that is entirely outside the law. And Wayne is so right. The bottom line to this entire debate hinges on the recognition of what public lands are and what they are not. Because actually in the Raymond Yowell case, where the cattle were just recently seized, he has fee title, or the tribe does, to that land. There's case after case on that. But
yet they came back at him without, of course, answers. No answers to the question, and his question, of course, was settlement of the Ruby Valley Treaty. Is it in effect or is it not? If it's in effect, you guys go away. If it's not in effect, show us why it's not in effect. And they won't address that. They just kept on lying to him. Now, how do we fight this? How do we combat this?
Well, let me say first that the feds have always been scared to death of the Treaty of Ruby Valley.
Mhm.
And granted, the treaty is very short, it's very vague, and I don't claim to be an authority on the Treaty of Ruby Valley.
Mhm.
But nevertheless, it is a valid treaty. And they have been scared to death. Well, I'm saying they, the federal
The feds,
representatives,
yeah.
that that treaty would be upheld and those Indian rights upheld, as many of us think they should be.
That puts them in big trouble.
But one of the reasons that has happened, and one of the reasons, in fact it's the underlying reason, why we have so much chaos throughout the state of Nevada on this issue, why people's property is being stolen right and left, and not only here but in other states throughout the West too, why the BLM and the Forest Service are running over people right and left. The fundamental reason why that's happening is because we have a virtual total breakdown in the exercise of lawful jurisdiction by the state and the subdivisions, the counties.
Right.
We have sheriffs, and just like in the Raymond Yowell case, you have a sheriff that any way you want to slice that, and a brand department aiding and abetting the theft.
That's right.
Now, this is a total breakdown of any lawful structure in the state. And of course that goes back, and they say, well, we've had an attorney general for the last, what, 12 years that has basically been a tool of the environmental movement, primarily the National Wildlife Federation. And their objective is to drive, they and the Natural Resource Defense Council and the Sierra Club, their objective is to drive the American citizen off the resource base in favor of the international creditors that hold a lien against our natural resources. And they're financed, those groups are financed by those entities. And Frankie Sue has been basically a tool of them.
Absolutely.
In my case, when I filed this case, and my case was filed on the sanctity of Nevada water law. Frankie Sue actually attempted to hire Tom Lustig of the National Wildlife Federation to represent the state of Nevada against me and against Nevada's own water law. Now don't try to make sense out of that because it doesn't make sense, but it did happen.
I've been trying to make sense out of a whole bunch of these things and it's not happened. Out at Palomino Valley, I spent last weekend out there just to see what was going on. And these people, these BLM people, acted terrified of us. I mean, here we are, all of us out there, nobody's waving guns, nobody's threatening, nobody's yelling, nothing. We had one person had a bullhorn and tried to give them a lesson in Constitution, and they wouldn't listen. That was it. That was a total extent of our violence. But they were, when people would drive up, they had one little girl running up and down the fence writing down license numbers. I mean, how ridiculous. Like I was supposed to intimidate her. And I walked over to the fence and handed her my card. I said, here, we'll make it a little easier for you. And she jumped back. She looked at me almost terrified. And she took my card like this.
Oh.
I mean, that's the attitude they have. And then you have, like this picture, if we can get a shot of this picture, that's pretty famous, of
Want me to pick that up?
Ken Greenwell. Yeah, if you want to hold it up, and let's see if we can get a shot of that. Ken Greenwell, it was cold. I was out there that morning. It was cold outside. And he has a permit. He has a concealed carry permit. So he had his gun in his holster in the front seat of his truck. He was going to let some people sit in his truck to keep warm. Picked it up, went to the back of the truck, and this Ranger Ross drew down on him. And this ranger was shaking. He had his finger on the trigger. He could have killed this guy.
That is out of control.
It's totally out of control. So what are they being told about us?
One of the things,
you look like pretty desperate people.
One of the things that I think you have to understand, and although I don't brag about it, I did work a little while in my younger years for the Forest Service. I also actually worked for the BLM for a short period of time.
Is that right?
So, you know, everybody has to confess their sins, so I'll confess mine here tonight.
Right on
anyway,
television, nice going.
One of the things you have to remember is that the people down on the lower level in those agencies, like the people you're talking about, the BLM people, they don't have a clue really what's going on.
Right.
And so the people above them, and keep in mind that BLM is basically controlled by the Natural Resources Defense Council. And their objective is to drive the American citizen off the resource base. BLM people in the higher levels then put that bunch of other BLM employees out there who don't really know what's going on. And then they tell them a bunch of scare stories about how bad the American citizens are.
Right.
And how their lives are being threatened, and all by people like you and people like my wife and myself, whoever.
Right.
We're all bad, see? And so they get all these people hyped up and worried about us, and they really don't have a clue as to what's going on. So to get mad at the BLM people, the Forest Service people down the lower level, in my opinion, is futile. They don't know what's going on. You have to get to a higher level. Now, when you get to the state director, you get to the district directors, things like that. They know more as you go up the ladder.
Yeah.
And some of those people know exactly what's going on and why. That's where your problem is.
Right. Now, I invited Bob Abbey, who's the BLM chief around here. I don't know if he's all in Nevada or just northern Nevada, but he's written some pretty derogatory things, made some comments that I didn't approve. Anyway, I invited him because I thought it was only fair. I said, you know, we're going to be talking about you. You should be here to make sure that we say the right thing. Well, he's in Ely tonight. He couldn't make it. So I went to the next in line. I wanted this Jolynn Worley, who put out the press release, which I want to get to in a minute, after they sold Raymond's cattle. No, she couldn't make it, and finally they sent me a fax. It said, Mr. Grover, thanks for the invitation, but it's too late. Nobody's going to be able to be on. So it's the same old story with the federal agencies, that they just don't want to take part in a discussion.
The way those agencies work with the press, and take my own case for instance. In the beginning, when the Forest Service was attacking me, then the Forest Service, the BLM, their supporters in the environmental movement, or their controllers, I should say, in the environmental movement, they were exercising the press not only all over the United States, but even the foreign press, about what a bad guy I was.
Right.
Then we got it into court, and I started to win. Because reporters first used to come to me to, or go to the Forest Service or BLM and get the truth, and then they'd come to me to see how I was lying. And then it got to where, when I kept winning in the courts, they would kind of give us even time. And then towards the end, it got to where they'd come to me and find out what the truth was, and then go to the BLM or Forest Service to see how they were lying.
See, exactly right.
But the effect of that was that when they thought they were on a roll, you read about this in every paper in the country. When we started to win, nothing.
Nothing.
Now, January 29th, we got down what undoubtedly is the most momentous decision on these western lands in 140 years. And have you read anything about it in the press?
No.
And you
No.
won't.
Well, the press that I read, I've read a lot about it, but no, in general. No.
Now, if we were here on the defensive and had lost something in the courts, you can bet, Mr. Abbey,
it would be right here.
One of the other head bureaucrats would be over here pontificating about how right they were.
Exactly.
But when we win, they don't show. That's basically the way it works.
Well, apparently we're winning a lot because I've invited just about every federal agency there is, and nobody's taken us up. Did get a couple of sheriffs on, but they weren't too talkative. That was another thing that took place out there. And I want to go back just for a minute to the Ruby Valley Treaty, because I want people to understand what that's all about. Brendan, I've got a clip of Bonnie Bob explaining the Ruby Valley Treaty, where people can understand what it was, and this is what Raymond Yowell was saying was in force so that they couldn't take his cattle. Brendan, if you'll run that way.
That one treaty. Okay, Bobby, could you explain the treaty between the Shoshone Indian tribe and the United States government?
First of all, it isn't a treaty between the Shoshone and the United States government. It's a treaty between the western bands of Shoshone and the people and government of the United States. Therefore, the people are all individually responsible for what's happening today as well. They have a party to it. They can stop the action. The treaty is, and Judge McKibben violated this. The treaties are the supreme law of the land, and under Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution, it says that, and it also says that all judges are bound to those treaties. The treaty has been abused, and all treaties probably throughout the United States have been abused. I mean, it's always the same old story. Right now, they have a land claims bill that they're trying to buy the Shoshone land. They have not purchased it. Part of the treaty, in I think it's Article 4, says that, you know, the Shoshone were always migrants. You know, they always followed the pine nut and the wildlife, because we're in the desert. And it says whenever they chose to give up their roaming life, they would become agriculturalists and herdsmen. So they've chosen to become herdsmen, and that's what this is about. I mean, they have their herds, they're abiding by the treaty. This was on Shoshone land, not only Shoshone land, but, I mean, there's a difference between the nation and the tribe. There's the Shoshone Nation, which goes the whole way to Idaho, over to Utah, down into California, to the Mojave Desert. And the tribe, the tribal land is established on there. Those are U.S. government entities. That tribe also has a land claim in this, because the legislation or the agreement that is set up under, signed by the Secretary of the Interior in 1941, says that they retain all grazing rights and water rights. So if these grazing rights and water rights are violated, the U.S. government can break any treaty and go on to any reservation, or any land. So that means that all grazing rights, all water rights are in danger by this action.
Okay, now the BLM is going to say that this is you were on federal property. Now, has this ever been settled in court?
No. No. In fact, you know, everybody, you know, the BLM keeps saying the Carrie Dan case, Carrie Dan v. U.S., and that was a grazing issue with Carrie Dan individually. In the appeal of that case in the federal court, Judge Bruce Thompson in 1986 ruled that the treaty was in full force and effect, and that land title had never been litigated. So while they tell you there's certain things about grazing, that's not the issue. The issue is that land title has never been litigated. Now, the claims bill that Harry Reid is trying to push down everybody's throat, that would be the only thing that would stop the ownership of the land by the Shoshone people.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Now, you were in Congress. I contacted Jim Gibbons, our congressman now, and I'm not going to say anything, but I'm going to read the statement that he faxed to me, because I called and said, we'd just like to have your input on this issue of the Ruby Valley Treaty of cattle theft. And his response was, ever since coming to Washington 6 years ago, I have been actively working to address the concerns of Native Americans and ranchers in Nevada, and I believe we're making progress. However, it does not help our efforts when existing laws are not being complied with. I agree wholeheartedly that these ranchers have legitimate concerns, and I plan to continue to fight for a fair resolution. Now, who is he saying is not complying with the law? Did you ever write trash like this when... did you ever write stuff like this when you were...
I know Jim Gibbons, and I served on the Natural Resources Committee with Jim, and I like him.
I like him too, actually.
But what I do want to say is that Raymond Yow was complying with the law.
Right.
And the fact is, Raymond Yow never had his day in court. And I don't care who you are. If you're an American or a Native American, you certainly have a right to have your day in court. And that is what is so egregious about these cattle seizures, because they don't get a court order, they don't go through due process, and there are many pieces of case law. I wish I could sit down with Jim Gibbons. He's a good lawyer, but I'd like to just point out the pieces of case law relative to tribes that recognize their rights that have been recognized by the state, that were recognized because they settled the land. And those rights are recognized under state law, and that's what was so good about Wayne's decision, is because this judge said federal government can't grant rights, property rights, only the state can. And Raymond Yell's rights were recognized by the state. But when you have a federal government who will bypass the court and by force, not force of law, but by just the force of the fact that they're bigger and they have the guns, and they